right, if you would open your Bibles, we left off in Joshua chapter 9, and that's where we'll pick up this morning. I have behind me a map on the board, which we will use if we get to the next chapter. I'm hoping that we will get to the next chapter this morning. I realize that there are, of course, elements of this map that are not to scale because it is hand-drawn, and there's already several people who have given me a hard time about it, but, you know, next time you can draw the map. I'll just say it that way. Okay, I jest. Let's read Joshua chapter 9, and really chapters 9, 10, and 11 all kind of focus on the Canaanite response to Israel's invasion of the land. And with so much excessive battle, with each successive battle that's described in Joshua, what you're going to see is that each account becomes a little shorter and a little shorter because, you know, basically it's the same outcome every time. Israel always wins because God is fighting for them. The battle belongs to the Lord, as we just sang about. So Jericho's account is the most detailed, Ai's is the second most detailed, then we have a battle of 5 kings, and then we have Hazor, and by chapter 12 it's just, here's a list of people we defeated. You figure the rest out and fill in the blanks. But there's a little contrast here going on. In chapter 9, it came about when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan, in the hill country and in the lowland and on all the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite and the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite heard of it, that they gathered together with one accord to fight Joshua and to fight with Joshua and with Israel. So how is that different from what we've seen before in Joshua? Right. Well, no, not joining their side. That's not what's happening. So now the Canaanites are on the offensive, right? You know, whereas Israel's been on the offensive before, now the Canaanites have switched to the offensive. All the kings here, they gathered themselves together to fight. Now, is this the same? We haven't seen this before. What have we seen before? How have they been reacting previously to Israelite success? Just living in their own lands, you know, watching TV, enjoying themselves. No reaction at all? Done. Yes. Right. Yeah, earlier in Joshua, Rahab described in chapter 2 and verse 10 how the hearts melted at the thoughts of Israel coming into the land. And how in chapter 5 and verse 1, when they crossed over the Jordan, the people of the land of Canaan, everyone who heard of it, their hearts melted. But now they're no longer paralyzed by fear, now they're motivated to fight. Now, we could chalk this up to how Israel, you know, finally displayed a weakness in that they had a loss at Ai. You know, and that's possible. I wouldn't rule that out. But the text itself explicitly tells us in chapter 11, in verse 20, one of the things that had been going on is that it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, to meet Israel in battle, in order that He might utterly destroy them. That they might receive no mercy, but that He might destroy them just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Now, we'll talk more about that in chapter 11, but there's a sense in which, just like God hardened the heart of Pharaoh and allowed him to sort of take this self-destructive course of action, you see God hardening the hearts of the Canaanites in the same thing, provoking them to meet Israel in battle so that they might be destroyed. Now, the Gibeonites, on the other hand, well, we get to the verse 3 of chapter 9, the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai. They also acted craftily and set out as envoys and took worn out sacks on their donkeys and wineskins, worn out and torn and mended, and worn out and patched sandals on their feet, and worn out clothes on themselves. And all the bread of their provision was dry and had become crumbled. And they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a far country. Now therefore make a covenant with us." And the men of Israel said to the Hivites, "Well, perhaps you are living within our land. How then shall we make a covenant with you?" They said to Joshua, "We are your servants." Joshua said to them, "Who are you, and where do you come from?" They said to him, "Your servants have come from a very far country because of the fame of the Lord your God. For we have heard the report of him and all that he did in Egypt and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon king of Heshbon and to Og king of Bashan who was at Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, 'Take provisions in your hand for the journey and go to meet them and say to them, we are your servants. Now then, make a covenant with us. This our bread was warm when we took it out for provisions out of our houses on the day we left to come to you. But behold, now it is dry and has become crumbled. These wineskins, which we filled, were new, and behold, they are torn. These our clothes and our sandals are worn out because of the very long journey.' So the men of Israel took some of their provisions and did not ask for the counsel of the Lord. Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them." All right, well, this brings our attention to the map over here. All right, and what happens is Israel is on the other side of the Jordan, and these places in red are basically more guesses than we know for certain where they are, but we'll use them for the time being. Israel crosses the Jordan, they camp at Gilgal, they conquer Jericho, then they go to Ai, and at some point they go up to Shechem and they read from the law. I don't know if that's chronologically in place or not, but anyhow, at this point, the people of Ai, or the people of Gibeon, you might start to think you were next on this little invasion path thing. So Gibeon responds and they say, well, we obviously can't beat them, so we're going to join them. Now, what do we have to say? That's obviously different from what the other Canaanites are doing. The other Canaanites are preparing themselves for war, while the Gibeonites are, preparing themselves to not get killed, or they're trying to ensure their survival in this particular instance. Now, when they come to Israel, what's their condition? What do they look like? We've come from a long way. Worn out clothes, worn out sandals, moldy bread, broken wineskins. We've clearly come from a long journey.
Something to think about in all this is chapter 10 says that Gibeon was one of the great cities of this time period.
Yeah.
And it appears that chapter 10 verse 1, that Jerusalem, there's more, but they all feared Gibeon.
Yeah, that's true. All these cities to the south are afraid of Gibeon. Gibeon's afraid of Israel. So there is kind of a neat little thing going on there. That this is one of the more powerful cities in that region, and they're saying, we can't handle this. They're the ones that, apparently they had the foresight to realize this. Now, just a few little facts about Gibeon. Gibeon later becomes a Benjamite city. It becomes part of the tribe of Benjamin, and we learn that in Joshua 18 and verse 25. It also becomes a Levitical city. The Levites control the city in Joshua 21:17. And here's another interesting fact. Gibeon is mentioned in the list of returnees from exile in Nehemiah chapter 7 and verse 25. There aren't many who return from Gibeon, but there are a few listed in the returnees from exile, which I think is interesting. That a good chunk of Israel doesn't survive their history, doesn't come back from captivity, but Gibeon does. Now, the Gibeonites have worn out clothes, moldy bread. What would be significant about that? They've come from a long journey. Who else has come from a long journey? The Israelites. Okay, right. And so when they came to Canaan from their long journey, they were in the same condition, right? Worn out clothes, moldy bread, broken sandals. Was that what Israel was like? They ate manna every day. Okay, good.
Another thing, 4 years of wandering around.
Yes. Deuteronomy 29 in verses 5 and 6 says that I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you. Your sandal has not worn out on your foot. You have not eaten bread, nor have you drunk wine or strong drink, in order that you might know that I am the Lord your God. God protected them and provided for them. And so there's this reminder that the Gibeonites, they exhibit all the natural signs of a long journey, but Israel didn't. Gibeon is what Israel would look like if they didn't have God's protection, we might say. The Gibeonites claim to have come from a far country. Why would they claim this? Why is this important? Okay, it's part of the trickery, yes. Wouldn't be an encroachment on the land, yes. The law itself said something about this too, didn't it? In Deuteronomy chapter 20, Moses made a distinction between two kinds of warfare. And I'm not going to read the chapter for sake of time, but we've read it before. But in Deuteronomy 20, there are rules for warfare. If you go to war with a country that is far away, you besiege them and you ask for terms of peace first. And if they agree to your peace, they can become your servants. And, they don't have to die. They can be spared. But if it's a city that dwells in the land of Canaan, you don't offer to make peace with them. You utterly destroy them. You don't leave alive anything that breathes, God says. There's two kinds of warfare. There's more of we're subjugating a faraway country, which David did to places like Moab and Edom and other places. And then we have what you're supposed to do to the Canaanites. Utter destruction. So when the Gibeonites say, we're from a faraway country, make an alliance with us. Well, that's an important distinction in Israel's law. Israel was permitted to make pacts with faraway nations. They were not permitted to make a covenant with the Canaanites.
Would Gibeon have known that?
That's a good question. And I've wondered about that too. Why does Gibeon know to claim this? I don't know. They do know to claim it somehow. There appears to be knowledge and awareness of Israel's reputation among the Gentiles. There appears to be an awareness of what God has done for Israel in taking them out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, crossing the Jordan. Word gets back to the Canaanites somehow of everything that God has done for Israel. So I don't know if it's totally inconceivable that word gets back to them about some of the laws or some of the rules that God has given Israel as well. I wouldn't completely rule out that possibility. But admittedly, I don't know for certain. That's just a guess. So. And in verse 7, what are the Gibeonites, what is their offer? Not verse 7, I have that mislabeled on here. Verse 8, what is their offer? We are your servants, right. Okay, this isn't a parity treaty. This isn't an agreement between two equals. They're saying we're going to submit to you and we'll become your vassals, basically. You'll become our masters. And Gibeon offers to basically submit itself to Israel. And in verses 9 and 10, we have a statement. What did the statement in verses 9 and 10 remind us of from earlier? We've come from a far country because of the fame of the Lord your God. We've heard all.
The first thing that it brothers coming down to Egypt.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not think of that. Okay. Okay, we've come from a faraway country. I'm going to think about that. That's I had not thought of that. I'm going to think about that one. James.
It reminds me a little of Solomon.
We've come from a long distance to hear the great wisdom of King Solomon. That's interesting. Okay.
That's after this.
Yeah, it is after.
Yeah, I guess there's something, to this idea, Joseph we're going to go to Egypt, to the Savior in Egypt, because there's famine in the land of Canaan. It's kind of a backwards result of what's going on in Gibeon. These are all interesting suggestions and good ideas. It wasn't exactly what I had thought of, but I like these. No, but what does it remind us of a little bit more recently that happened? We have heard of what your Lord has done. We heard what He did for you in Egypt. We heard how He defeated Sihon and Og, king of Heshbon. Rahab, yes. Yeah.
See, I have to
Sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. But yes, it does remind us of Rahab, I think. You go back to chapter 2. Verses 9 and 10, what does Rahab say to the spies? I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. She cites Israel's history as the reason why she's basically helping them out, is because... she cites the same 2 events they do actually too, the Exodus and the defeat of Sihon and Og. And here in Joshua 9 we have sort of the same thing going on. And they make a confession, basically, similar. The Gibeonites have seen, they've heard of God's power, and they don't want to be destroyed by it, just like Rahab didn't want to be destroyed by it. In verses 11 through 13, they tell a false history. We started with warm bread, we got dry, crumbly bread. We started with new wineskins, we got torn ones. We started with new clothes and shoes, and we get worn out clothes. And it's really just meant to convey the distance. And what is Israel's chief mistake here? They didn't consult God. We'll take your word for it. That's interesting. They actually, verse 7, they go, well, wait a second. What if you're one of the Canaanites? Oh, no, we're not. We promise we're not. Look, holy bread. I guess that answer satisfied them. But verse 14 says explicitly that they did not ask for the counsel of the Lord. And they go ahead and they make this alliance, just like in chapter 7. Israel fails to consult God at the crucial time. And especially ironic in light of the emphatic comments from the Canaanites about how, God's been helping you. Y'all had God on your side for so long. That's right. We'll make an alliance with you before we consult this God who's helped us out so much. It's a little ironic there. James.
It almost seems like they didn't.
No, it says in verse 15 that Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live. They're having this conversation with Joshua. In verse 6, they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal. Joshua has, he forgets to consult the Lord for whatever reason here. Now, we'll talk about the implications of this in a little bit. But there is definitely an implicit warning about the danger of swearing thoughtlessly. You make an oath and you make an agreement, and you don't think it through all the way. Yes, there is a big danger in not consulting the Lord as well. Well, of course, it doesn't take long for the cat to get out of the bag. In verse 16, it came about at the end of 3 days after they had made a covenant with them that they heard that they were neighbors and that they were living within their land. And then the sons of Israel set out and came to their cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon and Shepherah and Beeroth and Kiriath Jearim. The sons of Israel did not strike them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. And the whole congregation grumbled against the leaders. But all the leaders said to the whole congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Now we can't touch them. This we will do to them, even let them live, so that wrath will not be upon us for the oath which we swore to them. The leaders said to them, let them live. So they became hewers of wood and drawers of water for the whole congregation, just as the leaders had spoken to them. Then Joshua called for them and spoke to them, saying, why have you deceived us, saying, we are very far from you, when you are living within our land? Now therefore you are cursed, and you shall never cease being slaves, both hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. So they answered Joshua and said, because it was certainly told your servants that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. Therefore we feared greatly for our lives because of you, and have done this thing. Now behold, we are in your hands. Do as it seems good and right in your sight to do to us. Thus he did to them and delivered them from the hands of the sons of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place which he would choose. Alright, so they're exposed. The statement from verse 6, we've come from a far country, is now revealed to be a lie. They are found to be living right there in the land. The worry that Israel had that perhaps you were living in the land is found to be true. And Israel cannot strike the Canaanites. The congregation grumbles. Sounds a lot like the wilderness wandering in verse 18. And their grumbling is framed by the fact that they've sworn by Yahweh, the God of Israel. Now, of course, the Gibeonites, and they're confronted about this. Let's ask a question here. Were the Gibeonites well-intentioned in what they did? They were trying to save their skins, yeah. I mean, they're clearly aware of what God has done, you might say. You know, their motivation is very similar to Rahab's. Were their methods completely appropriate? No, they lied. Okay, all right. So, you know, there's kind of a double whammy here. On the other hand, you know, their methods, you know, they had the right. I think they had the right motives, but they had the wrong way of going about it. You know, what does this suggest? Well, James.
It also, to me, it looks like the Gibeonites. They're saying this, but it almost seems like they know more what God wants the Israelites to do than the Israelites do. Does that make sense?
There's a little irony to that, yeah.
They were telling Israel what they were supposed to be doing, and Israel's supposed to
I mean, in verse 24, they explain their motives again. We're afraid that, you know, because we heard what the Lord your God told you to do, and we're kind of afraid of the Lord your God. We fear Him. So, you know, if they fear Him, then, you know, on some level, the desire that God had for the Canaanites to sort of get their act together is at least clicked in these people's heads. And as a result of this, Gibeon is spared. You know, their intentions play out right. But does Gibeon get completely off the hook? No, they become servants, they become subjugated, so they're spared for their good intentions, but they're punished for their deceptive methods. You know, I guess, you know, they find it better to be a slave in the Lord's house than a corpse outside the camp. And, you know, if other Canaanite groups had maybe realized this, perhaps
It sort of sounds like they were willing to accept that.
it seems like, you know, the very first thing they said is, we are your servants. So, you know, we before we get worked up too much over the fact that Gibeonites lied, you know, Rahab also lied. You know, we got to remember that as well. It's kind of interesting that two stories about deceivers defecting to the Israelites kind of parallel each other in this instance. Wood choppers, water drawers, that's a role of subservience. Deuteronomy 29 indicates that all the wood choppers and water drawers were still subject to the terms of the covenant. Now, did I see a hand? Keith, yes.
Check me if I'm wrong, but this seems like a huge conspiracy on part of the They had formed, it appears, the God of Israel, that he ends just by means of whatever we do. You know, as long as our motive is right, how we get there is important, but that's not the case.
Well, I mean, I don't want to read too much into the story as far as you know, the Gibeonite.
Joshua questioned them.
He questions them. Yeah, I mean, in the end, Gibeon is spared. For what it's, I mean, you know, they're spared. They have a place later on in Israel's history, which, you know, it's kind of hard to. That's kind of hard. It does challenge some of our preconceptions, I guess, about the relationship of means and motives and all that. But what I would say is this: does God hold Israel accountable for breaking the Gibeonite oath? Does God see this oath as binding? Probably. Yeah. Huh? At the time?
Well, he does, I mean, in chapter 10, he asked, the Gibeonites are being attacked, and Joshua, and they asked Joshua, are you going to just let your servants die here?
Oh,
And so God says, don't fear, Joshua, I have given these kings in your hands.
Okay, yeah.
So, on that hand, I mean, what's that? I don't know if it's...
There's another passage in the Old Testament history in 2 Samuel 21 that refers to this oath. It says that there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David sought the presence of the Lord. And the Lord said, it is for Saul and his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. And so the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the sons of Israel, but a remnant of the Amorites, and the sons of Israel made a covenant with them. But Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. David said to the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? And the Gibeonites began to give instruction and say, this is how you can make up for violating the covenant, basically. But it's interesting that God is the one that strikes Israel with famine because they violate this agreement here in Joshua chapter 9. So that's one interesting factor to tie into it. The problem, of course, we have is that Joshua himself appears to have an opinion about the situation. But we don't really get this divine inspired judgment on Gibeonites, what you did was bad. Here's a slap on the wrist. Well, the main slap on the wrist they get is becoming wood choppers and water drawers. But the apparent motivation for their conspiracy, or however we want to put it, is that they are afraid of what God has been doing. They are genuinely aware of who God is, and it's like, by whatever means necessary, we want to be on that side and not on the losing side. Now, if their means are wrong, perhaps we can chalk that up to immaturity, perhaps we can chalk that up to malicious intent, I don't know, but the text does not say, and so I don't know how much further I'm willing to go than that on that point. Yes, Don? Right. Well, and we shouldn't expect anybody in the story to be perfect either. There's the other side of it. Yeah. Here's another flip side of the coin. What happens if you make a promise, you make a vow, and that puts you in, some kind of state of disobedience to what God has instructed of you? You still have to keep the vow. There's an interesting question there. Better to not vow than to vow and not pay. Ecclesiastes 5:5. Pay what you vow. There's a whole question here. It's kind of this logic of you made your bed, now sleep in it, is what God is saying to Israel in 2 Samuel 21. When people make a foolish vow that puts them in a state of disobedience, apparently they're still expected to keep it. So don't commit to things you don't intend to follow through on. If that's true of a matter of disobedience, how much more of a matter of indifference to God? People want to say, well, the Lord doesn't really care about me keeping this agreement, so I don't have to. Well, you do. The Lord doesn't really want me to do this, so I don't have to keep that agreement. Well, no, you do. Because, look at Gibeon, look at the case that's made there.
There's also a difference between making a vow based on something that you thought was acceptable and making a vow was acceptable. As far as they knew at the time, and maybe that's why God accepted the vow, expected them to keep the vow. I don't know. Well, I guess the main thing, well, for whatever else has happened, it's clear that this is, on the one hand, it is a violation of what Deuteronomy 7 and Deuteronomy 20 teaches, that the Canaanites were to be utterly exterminated. And on the other hand, well, here's an instance of Canaanites defecting because they fear the Lord. And on the other hand, I'm running out of hands here. On the other hand, what we have is a situation where the oath itself is made with not the best means possible. There's deception and guile. Could it have been different if they said, we want to become part of Israel, we want to circumcise ourselves, we want to defect to the God of Israel and participate in your covenant, and we forsake our Canaanite paganism roots? No, maybe God would have accepted that as well, but probably would have accepted that. The whole reason that there's so much time that elapses between the promise to Abraham and the promise and the final fulfillment of that promise, or the land fulfillment of that promise here in Canaan, is the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full, which I take to mean that God is giving them time to repent, because the Lord is not slow about His promise of judgment, to enact judgment on people, but is patient towards you, not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. Now, perhaps one holds out the optimism that the Gibeonites would have learned something about the God of Israel and His attitude towards deception, after defecting, and they would realize that their methods were not exactly the best. One holds out that optimism, but the text is, of course, silent on that point. So I don't have anything else to say on that. Any other thoughts, comments on chapter 9? With the 10 minutes we have left. Chapter 10.
It came about when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king. So he had done to Ai and its king, and when the inhabitants of Gibeon and made peace with Israel and were within their land, he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. Therefore Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent word to Hoham, king of Hebron, to Piram, king of Jarmuth, to Japhia, king of Lachish, to Debir, king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me and help me, and let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons of Israel. So the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon gathered together and went up, they with all their armies, and camped by Gibeon and fought against it. Okay, this is where we need the map. All right. All right. Now, you see what's happened here. Israel has taken Jericho, they have taken Ai, and all these cities, and silly me, I forgot to put Jarmuth on the map, but Jarmuth is probably located around here somewhere. What we have here is, you have Jerusalem, you have Hebron, Lachish, and Eglon, and Jarmuth, wherever it is, all cities to the south of where they're at. With Gibeon joining Israel, you see what's starting to happen to the land of Canaan, right? From a tactical standpoint, it's only a matter of time before they cut the land of Canaan in half. These guys on the south are going, we got to band together before they start tearing us up, limb from limb. So these kings gather together and they fight the battle with Israel. You can kind of see what's going on. And so really most of chapter 10 is about how Israel takes the key cities in southern Canaan. They move into northern Canaan in chapter 11, a little bit more to the north, and start taking some of those cities as well. But what happened here in verse 6, the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, saying, Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us. So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the valiant warriors. The Lord said to Joshua, Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not one of them shall stand before you. So Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. And the Lord confounded them before Israel. He slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and pursued them by the way of the ascent of Beth-horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. As they fled from before Israel, while they were at the descent of Beth-horon, the Lord threw large stones from heaven on them, as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon, in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. There was no day like that, before it or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. And Joshua and all Israel with them returned to the camp at Gilgal. Alright, so chapter 10 kind of starts off with a contrasting response. When Gibeon heard what had happened, they took any means necessary to make peace with Israel. When Adonizedek hears what happens, let's call for war. Peace becomes a motivation for war, actually. He says, the Gibeonites made peace, so we're going to war now. We have these 5 kings allied together, and Gibeon calls for help. Do not fail us. Do not abandon us. It's the same term that God used when He said that I will not fail you nor forsake you in Joshua chapter 1. And we see this battle. What do we know about this? How much are we told about this battle that takes place here between these 5-king coalition and Israel? God did most of the work. Yeah, you don't get much of a description of Israel doing this and Israel doing that and Israel doing this. You get comments about how God fights the battle instead. Verse 8, verse 10, verse 11, verse 12, 14, 19, 25, 30, 32, and 42 all emphasize the fact that God is the one who gives Israel the victory, and no one else. God, in verse, yes?
But there's also a lot of mention of nature.
Oh yeah, God uses the natural elements to fight them. Yeah. Verse 10, God confounds the armies of the 5 kings. Verse 11, hailstones fall from the sky, and they kill more people than the Israelites do. Verse 12, the sun stands still. What's the point of the sun standing still? Or more time to finish the battle? Yeah.
Where's
Ajalon? Let me check. I don't know if it shows up on my map or not in here. It's not on the map on the board. I'm sorry about that. But I do not know offhand where the Valley of Ajalon is. I will have to...
I'm just wondering why it says in the Valley of Ajalon.
You know what? It slipped my mind to even look that up. I will look that up in due course and find out for you. But the reference to Gibeon is in there. Of course, we understand why Gibeon's relevant, but the Valley of Ajalon, I'd have to double check on Atlas somewhere. There's a comment in verse 13 about the book of Jasher. The book of Jasher is something that is lost to us. We don't have access to it, but we know it exists because the Bible quotes it twice, once in Joshua 10 and once in 2 Samuel 1 in verse 18, where David is writing his lament for Saul and Jonathan. And there's actually 3 possible ways to translate these comments about the sun standing still. One of them is that, of course, the sun is standing still, which I think is the most likely. But some people think this is an eclipse, and some people think this is a bad omen in the sky to terrify the enemy. Those are probably less likely, but throw them out there because they are suggested renderings. There's also a little play on the concept of standing. No one can stand before Israel in verse 8. None shall stand before you. In verse 12 and 13, the sun and the moon are told to stand still. And in verse 19, Israel is told, do not stand, do not stay there, but pursue instead. So there's that little play going on as well. Anybody have any comments on the battle that takes place here? This is a... All right, well, the battle concludes with the 5 kings getting captured. The 5 kings have fled and hidden themselves in the cave at Makkedah. So that brings us here. They're hiding at that location, and Israel kind of comes down, will bring us there. I don't know if that's the exact route they took. I'm guessing because I'm using dry erase markers. The 5 kings had fled and hidden themselves in the cave of Makkedah. And it was told Joshua, saying, the 5 kings have been found hidden in the cave at Makkedah. Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave, and assign men by it to guard them. But do not stay there yourselves, but pursue your enemies and attack them in the rear. Do not allow them to enter their cities, for the Lord your God has delivered them into your hand. It came about when Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished slaying them with a very great slaughter until they were destroyed, and the survivors who remained of them had entered the fortified cities, that all the people returned to the camp to Joshua at Makkedah in peace. No one uttered a word against any of the sons of Israel. Then Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave and bring these 5 kings out to me from the cave. They did so and brought these 5 kings out to him from the cave. The king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. When they brought these kings out to Joshua, Joshua called for all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings. So they came near and put their feet on their necks. And Joshua said to them, do not fear nor be dismayed. Be strong and courageous, for thus the Lord will do to all your enemies with whom you fight. So afterward Joshua struck them and put them to death. And he hanged them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. And it came about at sunset that Joshua gave a command, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves, and put large stones over the mouth of the cave to this very day. Okay, so I'll ask a few questions. First of all, why does Israel put their feet on the necks of the kings? What's that for? Total dominance. We might see an idea of Psalm 110, verse 1. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Isaiah 51 talks about walking on the backs of your enemies after you've defeated them. Joshua, you'll notice, also repeats his commission from chapter 1. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear. The Lord is giving these enemies into your hand. Okay, secondly, large stones. Why are the large stones significant in this story? Are they significant in this story? Just throw in random details. Large stones. Okay, there's a sort of a monument, right? Now you'll notice how they bookend this actually. You know, the kings hide in the cave. Joshua says, roll large stones over the cave. Then we take them out, we kill them, we hang them, then we put them back in the cave and roll the large stones back over the door. James?
Well, we talked about the other day that the tree was kind of a dying on the tree. Mm-hmm. Here we have big stones.
Yes. Well, yeah, there's definitely a contrast taking place. Every person that is hanged on a tree in the book of Joshua is a king. And the law explicitly said that whoever hangs on a tree is cursed of God. Deuteronomy 21 verses 22 and 23. Now the question is, of course, and Paul applies that passage to Jesus in Galatians 3:13, that Jesus became a curse for us, as it is written, cursed is every man who hangs on a tree. So, you know, on the one hand, you got these kings who all are cursed by God, they deserve to be hung on a tree. But the King of Kings, who did not deserve to be hung on a tree, hung on our tree in our place instead. And after dying on the tree, the Gospel of Matthew says that he was sealed in a cave with a large stone. Matthew 27 and verse 60. But while the kings of Canaan are taken out of the grave explicitly to be killed and put back in the grave again, Jesus comes out of the grave, the angel rolls away the large stone. Jesus comes out of the grave and does not go back into the grave again. He stays out forevermore, never to die again. So there is definitely, I think there is a connection, but it is definitely one of contrast. What happens to the kings of Canaan is the opposite of what happens to Jesus. And the hanging on a tree and the large stones simply serve to link the stories together. So it's kind of an interesting idea there. We're out of time, so we're going to stop at verse 27 unless anybody has any further comments or questions. And we'll pick up in verse 28 next time.